Willa Hartridge moved through the crowded hallways of Roosevelt High School like a shadow, her slight frame barely registering in the sea of students rushing between classes. At barely 5 feet tall, with mousy brown hair that perpetually fell across her face like a protective curtain, she had perfected the art of invisibility over years of practice. Her oversized hoodies, always in muted colors of gray or navy, hung loose on her thin frame, carefully chosen to obscure any hint of the athletic build beneath. The worn jeans she favored had been deliberately selected from thrift stores, not out of financial necessity, but because their faded appearance helped her blend into the background of teenage mediocrity she had cultivated as armor against unwanted attention. Her habit of keeping her eyes fixed on the scuffed linoleum floors made her appear even smaller than she already was, shoulders hunched forward in a posture of submission that contradicted everything her father had tried to teach her about carrying herself with confidence. The weight of her oversized backpack, stuffed with textbooks and notebooks, covered in neat, careful handwriting, pulled her even further into herself as she navigated the maze of lockers and classroom doors that defined her daily existence. What none of her classmates knew, what none of them could have possibly guessed from her carefully constructed facade of vulnerability, was that beneath those baggy clothes lay muscle earned through years of rigorous training that would have challenged seasoned athletes. Her slender arms concealed surprising strength, developed through countless hours of pull-ups, push-ups, and rope climbing. Her legs, hidden beneath loose-fitting denim, possessed the explosive power and endurance that came from running obstacle courses in full gear, practicing combat roles on unforgiving terrain, and learning to move silently across any surface. Willa's father, Colonel James Hartridge, had been deployed overseas for most of her childhood, serving multiple tours in Afghanistan and Iraq as part of an elite special forces unit whose missions remained classified even after his death. During his brief returns home, which came in sporadic intervals between deployments that sometimes lasted 8 months or more, he had insisted on teaching his daughter skills that went far beyond typical parent-child activities. While other kids learned to ride bikes in suburban driveways, Willa learned hand-to-hand combat in the basement of their military housing, her father's patient voice guiding her through techniques designed to neutralize opponents twice her size. The basement had been transformed into a makeshift dojo with thick mats covering the concrete floor and mirrors mounted on the walls so Willa could observe and correct her form. Heavy bags hung from reinforced ceiling beams, their surfaces worn smooth by years of impact from small fists that grew stronger and more precise with each training session. Her father had installed pull-up bars, rope climbing apparatus, and even a small obstacle course that he would reconfigure regularly to keep her training challenging and unpredictable. While other children her age played video games or watched cartoons, Willa practiced tactical maneuvers and weapons handling under her father's watchful eye. He taught her to strip and reassemble various firearms blindfolded, though he was careful to emphasize that such knowledge was purely defensive and came with tremendous responsibility. She learned to navigate by compass and stars, to move through dense forest without making a sound, and to survive in hostile environments using only what she could carry in a small pack. Her father's motto had always been carved into a piece of oak that hung above the basement entrance: hope for the best, prepare for the worst. He had prepared his daughter for situations she prayed she would never encounter, instilling in her not just physical capabilities, but a tactical mindset that assessed threats, calculated risks, and always maintained awareness of her surroundings. Even as a child, Willa could enter a room and within seconds identify all exits, potential weapons, and the relative threat level posed by every person present. Colonel Hartridge's approach to training his daughter went beyond mere physical preparation. He spent hours teaching her about honor, restraint, and the responsibility that came with possessing skills that could seriously harm others. He would tell her stories from his deployments, carefully edited to remove the most traumatic details, but rich with lessons about protecting the innocent, showing mercy to the defeated, and understanding that true warriors fought only when all other options had been exhausted. Violence, he would tell her as they sat together on the back porch after particularly intensive training sessions, is like a loaded weapon. It should never be drawn unless you intend to use it, and it should never be used unless there is no other choice. The strongest people are often the gentlest because they understand the consequences of their strength. These lessons were reinforced through countless exercises that taught Willa not just how to fight, but when to fight and when to walk away. Her father would create scenarios, role-playing different types of conflicts, and challenging her to find non-violent solutions before resorting to physical force. He taught her de-escalation techniques, how to read body language and recognize the difference between genuine threats and mere posturing, and most importantly, how to control her own emotions when adrenaline and anger threatened to override rational thinking. Roosevelt High was Willa's third school in 4 years, another consequence of following her father's military postings before he was killed in action 18 months ago during a classified operation in eastern Afghanistan. The official report, heavily redacted and full of bureaucratic language, had told her nothing about how he died or why, only that he had given his life in service to his country and that his actions had saved the lives of his fellow soldiers. The funeral had been held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The flag draped over his coffin, later folded and presented to Willa by a young officer whose eyes couldn't quite meet hers as he expressed the nation's gratitude for her father's sacrifice. Now living with her Aunt Margaret in suburban Denver, a woman who meant well but understood nothing about military life or the unique challenges faced by children who had grown up in that world, Willa had hoped this move would be different. Her aunt's house, a modest 2-story colonial in a neighborhood where the biggest concerns involved property values and homeowner association regulations, felt alien and confining after years of base housing and the structured predictability of military life. Margaret Hartridge Coleman had been her father's younger sister, a real estate agent who had never married, and whose knowledge of raising teenagers came primarily from self-help books and well-meaning advice from friends. She had cleared out her home office to create a bedroom for Willa, decorating it in pastels and floral patterns that clashed dramatically with Willa's austere preferences. The walls were covered with motivational posters featuring kittens and rainbows, inspirational quotes about following dreams and believing in yourself that felt hollow and meaningless to someone who had already seen more of the world's harsh realities than most adults. The house itself was filled with ceramic figurines, throw pillows, and other decorative items that served no functional purpose. A stark contrast to the military housing where every object had been chosen for its utility and everything had its designated place. Margaret's approach to household management was chaotic and emotionally driven, the opposite of the disciplined environment Willa had known all her life. Meals were often haphazard affairs involving takeout or frozen dinners, eaten while watching television shows that Margaret found entertaining, but that struck Willa as frivolous and pointless. Despite her aunt's genuine desire to provide a stable home, the cultural gap between them felt insurmountable. Margaret would try to engage Willa in conversations about boys, fashion, and social media, topics that held no interest for someone whose formative experiences had involved learning to field strip assault rifles and navigate hostile territory. When Willa attempted to maintain her physical training routine, practicing combat forms in the backyard or running long distances through the neighborhood, Margaret would worry aloud about her becoming too masculine or antisocial, concerns that revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of who Willa was and what she needed to remain grounded. Willa had promised herself that this new beginning would be different from her previous school experiences, She would keep her head down, focus on her studies, graduate quietly, and honor her father's memory by staying out of trouble. The plan was simple in concept but challenging in execution, particularly for someone whose instincts had been honed to identify and respond to threats before they could fully develop. Violence, her father had taught her through both words and example, was a last resort reserved only for protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. This philosophy, which had guided his entire military career and every aspect of his approach to training his daughter, was now tested daily by the social dynamics of Roosevelt High School, an environment where different but no less real forms of warfare played out among teenagers who had no idea what actual conflict looked like. That philosophy was tested most severely by Bridget Kane and her two loyal followers, Autumn Walsh and Skylar Morrison, who had established themselves as the undisputed rulers of Roosevelt High's social hierarchy through a combination of inherited privilege, physical intimidation, and psychological manipulation. Bridget Kane commanded attention the moment she entered any room, her presence announced by the sharp staccato of expensive heels against polished floors and the subtle but unmistakable shift in energy that occurred whenever apex predators moved through populated territory. Standing nearly 6 feet tall, even before her designer heels added additional inches to her already imposing frame, Bridget possessed the kind of effortless beauty that appeared on magazine covers and red carpets. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves that seemed to catch light from any available source, styled with the precision that could only be achieved through weekly appointments at Denver's most expensive salon. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of clothing that cost more than most families spent on groceries in a month, each outfit carefully coordinated to project wealth, status, and the kind of casual indifference to money that only came from never having to worry about it. Her green eyes, which might have been beautiful in a different context, held a cold intelligence that catalogued weaknesses and calculated precisely how to exploit them for maximum effect. She had perfected the art of the cutting remark, the well-timed insult delivered with a smile, and the social ostracism that could destroy a teenage reputation with surgical precision. Her voice, cultivated through years of private coaching and theater training, could project warmth when she needed something, or slice through ambient noise like a blade when she wanted to inflict damage. Bridget's father, Robert Kane, owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across Colorado and had built his fortune on his ability to identify what people wanted most and then convince them they couldn't live without it. He had passed these skills on to his daughter, along with the financial resources and social connections that made her virtually untouchable within the high school ecosystem. Her mother, Catherine Kane, had been a model in her younger years before marrying into wealth and transitioning into a life of charity galas, country club politics, and the kind of social climbing that required constant vigilance and strategic thinking. The Kane family lived in a sprawling mansion in Cherry Hills Village, one of Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods, where property values started in the millions, and neighbors included professional athletes, tech entrepreneurs, and old money families whose wealth stretched back generations. Bridget had grown up surrounded by luxury that most people could only imagine, attended by housekeepers and nannies who catered to her every whim, while her parents focused on building their empire and maintaining their social position. This background of privilege had shaped Bridget's worldview in ways that made her particularly dangerous to students like Willa, who represented everything she had been taught to despise. In the Kane household, weakness was not tolerated. Vulnerability was seen as an invitation for exploitation, and people who couldn't fight back were considered legitimate targets for whatever treatment those in power chose to inflict. Autumn Walsh, Bridget's primary lieutenant in the campaign of systematic harassment that defined her approach to social dominance, came from a background that was comfortable, but not quite at the Kane family's level of obscene wealth. Her father was a successful orthopedic surgeon, who had built a thriving practice serving Denver's athletic community, while her mother managed the kind of interior design business that catered to clients who measured room renovations in tens of thousands of dollars rather than hundreds. Autumn had attached herself to Bridget during their freshman year, recognizing that alliance with the most powerful student in school would provide protection and status that she could never achieve on her own merit. She possessed the kind of sharp-featured beauty that looked striking in photographs but could appear harsh and predatory in person, particularly when she was engaged in the psychological warfare that served as entertainment for Bridget's inner circle. Her role in the group dynamics was that of the eager enabler, always ready with reinforcement for Bridget's cruelest observations and quick to escalate conflicts beyond what even Bridget might have originally intended. Autumn's own insecurities, stemming from her desperate need to maintain her position in the social hierarchy, made her particularly vicious towards students who represented easy targets. She had learned that the best way to avoid becoming a victim herself was to ensure that Bridget's attention remained focused on others. Skylar Morrison completed the triangle of harassment that had made life miserable for countless Roosevelt High students over the past 3 years. The daughter of a prominent local attorney and a mother who served on the school board, Skylar possessed insider knowledge of school policies and administrative blind spots that made her group's activities particularly difficult for faculty to address effectively. She was shorter than her companions, but made up for her lack of physical presence through a combination of strategic thinking and carefully cultivated connections throughout the school's power structure. Her mother's position on the school board meant that complaints about Skylar's behavior often disappeared into administrative bureaucracy, while her father's legal expertise helped her understand exactly how far she could push without crossing lines that would result in serious consequences. Together, the three formed a predatory pack that had perfected the art of institutional bullying, operating within the gray areas of school policy where their actions could be explained away as misunderstandings, accidents, or normal teenage social dynamics. They understood instinctively that the key to successful harassment lay not in dramatic confrontations that would attract adult attention, but in the steady application of psychological pressure that could destroy their target's confidence and social standing over time. Willa had first caught their attention during her second week at Roosevelt High, an incident that occurred near the chemistry lab during the brief window between second and third period when students moved through the hallways with purposeful urgency. She had been navigating the crowded corridor with her usual careful attention to her surroundings, staying close to the wall to avoid the main flow of foot traffic when a bottleneck formed near the lab entrance as students tried to enter the classroom while others emerged from the previous period. The collision that would change the trajectory of her entire high school experience had been genuinely accidental, the result of another student suddenly stopping in front of her to tie a shoelace while Bridget approached from the opposite direction with her usual expectation that other students would automatically clear her path. Willa, trapped between the stopped student and the wall, had no room to maneuver when Bridget swept past without looking, her expensive handbag swinging in a wide arc that caught Willa's shoulder and sent her stumbling into Bridget's path. The contact had been minimal, barely enough to jostle Bridget's perfectly balanced coffee cup or disturb the careful arrangement of her hair, but it had been enough to paint a target on Willa's back that would define her experience at Roosevelt High for months to come. In that moment of contact, Bridget's predatory instincts had identified everything she needed to know about this new student. Small, obviously poor, based on her clothing, friendless, and most importantly, someone who radiated the kind of vulnerability that practically invited exploitation. "Watch where you're going, freak!" Bridget had snarled, her green eyes flashing with genuine malice as she assessed the damage to her appearance and found her anger increasing rather than diminishing as she realized how insignificant the actual contact had been. The disproportion between the minor incident and her volcanic reaction spoke to deeper currents in Bridget's personality, a need to establish dominance over anyone who dared to exist in her proximity without proper deference. "Do you have any idea how much this jacket costs?" she had continued, her voice rising to ensure that nearby students would witness the confrontation and understand the social dynamics being established. The jacket in question, a designer piece that probably cost more than most students' families spent on clothing in an entire year, showed no actual damage from the brief contact. But the question wasn't really about the jacket itself. It was about establishing hierarchy, about making clear to everyone within hearing distance that Willa existed in a different category of humanity than Bridget, someone whose very presence was an affront that needed to be acknowledged and punished. The students who had stopped to watch the confrontation understood these dynamics instinctively, their faces showing the mixture of fascination and relief that came from witnessing someone else being selected as a target. Willa had mumbled an apology, the words barely audible above the ambient noise of the hallway, and tried to hurry away toward her next class. Her father's training had taught her to recognize the early stages of conflict escalation, and everything about this situation screamed danger to someone who had been taught to read social dynamics as carefully as military personnel read terrain maps. But Bridget's voice had followed her down the hallway like a heat-seeking missile designed to inflict maximum damage with surgical precision. "What a loser!" Bridget had announced to her assembled audience, her voice carrying clearly through the crowded space. "Bet she shops at thrift stores and sleeps on a mattress on the floor, probably doesn't even have a real bedroom in whatever trailer park she crawled out of." The laughter that erupted from Bridget's followers and several opportunistic bystanders had burned in Willa's ears like acid. But she had forced herself to keep walking, her shoulders rigid with the effort of maintaining control over her emotional response. Starting over at a new school meant avoiding confrontation, no matter how much her father's training screamed at her to stand her ground and establish consequences for this kind of treatment. The tactical part of her mind had automatically catalogued everything relevant about the encounter. Bridget's height and reach, her expensive but impractical footwear that would limit her mobility in actual physical confrontation, the way her followers positioned themselves to block escape routes while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. She had noted the number of potential witnesses, the proximity of faculty supervision, and the likelihood that any physical response would be viewed unfavorably by school administration, regardless of who had initiated the conflict. But beneath the analytical assessment ran a deeper current of recognition that chilled her more than the tactical considerations. She had seen this dynamic before, in the stories her father told about military units where toxic leadership created environments of systematic abuse, where those with power used it to destroy those who couldn't fight back. The setting was different, but the fundamental patterns were identical, and her father's voice echoed in her memory with warnings about what happened when good people chose to remain silent in the face of institutional evil. What followed were weeks of systematic harassment that demonstrated a level of sophisticated cruelty that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so personally devastating. Bridget and her crew approached psychological warfare with the kind of strategic thinking that her father would have recognized and respected if it had been applied to legitimate military objectives instead of the destruction of a teenage girl's emotional well-being. They began with simple physical harassment designed to establish dominance while maintaining plausible deniability. Bridget and her followers would time their movements through the hallways to coincide with Willa's schedule, approaching from behind to knock books from her arms as she walked to class. The impacts were always brief and could be explained as accidents to any adult who might witness them, but they occurred with suspicious frequency and were accompanied by theatrical apologies that dripped with false sincerity. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Bridget would exclaim, as Willa's carefully organized materials scattered across the hallway floor. "I totally didn't see you there. You're so tiny. It's like you're invisible or something." The forced apologies were worse than open hostility because they required Willa to participate in the fiction that these encounters were accidental, forcing her to smile and accept responsibility for collisions that were clearly intentional. She would find herself scrambling on her hands and knees to collect scattered papers, while other students stepped around her with careful indifference, their faces showing the kind of studied neutrality that people adopted when witnessing someone else's humiliation. Her notebooks, filled with neat handwriting and careful diagrams from months of dedicated study, would be stepped on by passing feet, leaving muddy footprints across pages of homework that had taken hours to complete. Her textbooks would slide under lockers or into corners where they collected dust and damage while she tried to retrieve them without blocking the flow of foot traffic that seemed to increase whenever she was most vulnerable. The pattern repeated itself with mechanical precision several times each week, always in locations where adult supervision was minimal, and always with enough variation in timing and method to maintain the fiction of accidental contact. Willa's hypervigilance, a survival trait developed through years of military-style training, made her acutely aware of the systematic nature of these encounters, but the evidence was circumstantial and would have been difficult to present convincingly to school administrators who were already overwhelmed with more obvious disciplinary problems. The harassment escalated during lunch periods, when the cafeteria's chaotic environment provided perfect cover for more aggressive forms of psychological manipulation. Bridget and her followers would position themselves strategically near the serving lines, waiting for Willa to approach with her tray before staging elaborate accidents that resulted in drinks and food being spilled across her clothing. "Oops, sorry," Autumn would say with exaggerated concern as she bumped into Willa from behind, causing her to stumble forward into Skylar, who would then accidentally knock Willa's drink across the front of her shirt. "We're so clumsy today. Here, let us help you clean that up." The offered assistance was part of the psychological torture, forcing Willa to stand still while her tormentors made theatrical attempts to clean stains that they had deliberately created, their touches lingering just long enough to feel invasive while maintaining the appearance of helpful concern. The sticky residue of spilled sodas would remain on her clothes throughout the afternoon, making her self-conscious and uncomfortable, while serving as a visible reminder to other students of her low position in the school's social hierarchy. These incidents occurred frequently enough that Willa began bringing extra clothing to school, storing clean shirts in her locker for emergencies that happened with suspicious regularity. But even this precaution became part of the harassment pattern, as her tormentors would time their attacks to occur late in the lunch period when she wouldn't have time to change before afternoon classes began. Sitting through chemistry or history with wet, sticky fabric clinging to her skin while the sweet smell of spilled drinks attracted flies and drew attention from other students became a regular form of torture that affected her ability to concentrate on her studies. Her grades, which had always been exemplary, began to suffer as the constant stress and humiliation made it difficult to focus on academic work that had once provided refuge from social difficulties. The worst incidents happened in locations where adult supervision was minimal, areas of the school that existed in administrative blind spots where student behavior was governed by the law of the jungle rather than official policies. The second-floor bathroom near the art wing became a place of particular dread for Willa after Bridget cornered her there one afternoon during the break between 6th and 7th periods. The encounter had been carefully planned, with Autumn and Skylar positioned as lookouts, while Bridget confronted Willa alone in the tiled space that echoed every sound and amplified every whispered threat. The bathroom's acoustics, designed for functionality rather than privacy, meant that even quiet conversations carried clearly throughout the space, allowing Bridget to deliver her psychological attacks with devastating effectiveness while maintaining the hushed tones that would avoid attracting attention from the hallway. "You know what your problem is?" Bridget had asked, her voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that came from someone who had never experienced genuine consequences for her actions. She had positioned herself between Willa and the exit, using her height advantage to create a sense of physical intimidation while maintaining enough distance to avoid any accusation of assault. Willa had remained silent, recognizing the question as rhetorical and understanding that any response would only provide additional ammunition for whatever psychological attack was being prepared. Her father's training had included extensive instruction on surviving interrogation and psychological pressure, techniques that proved surprisingly applicable to high school social dynamics. "Your problem," Bridget had continued, "is that you don't understand your place. You walk around here like you belong, like you're equal to the rest of us, but you're not. You're nothing. You're less than nothing. You're the kind of person who exists solely to make the rest of us feel better about ourselves by comparison." The words had been delivered with the kind of clinical precision that suggested practice, as if Bridget had rehearsed this speech specifically for maximum psychological impact. Her green eyes had remained fixed on Willa's face throughout the monologue, searching for signs of emotional damage, like a sniper looking for confirmation of a successful hit. "I could destroy you whenever I want," Bridget had added, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I could turn every single person in this school against you with a few well-placed rumors. I could make your life so miserable that you'd beg your pathetic aunt to transfer you somewhere else. But that would be too easy, too quick. I'm enjoying watching you suffer slowly." The threat had been followed by action that demonstrated Bridget's complete confidence in her ability to act without consequences. She had opened Willa's backpack, which had been sitting on the sink counter, and systematically removed its contents before dumping everything into the sink and turning on the water. Months of homework, carefully completed assignments, and irreplaceable notes from multiple classes had been ruined in seconds, the ink bleeding across pages that dissolved into illegible pulp. Willa had watched the destruction of her academic work with the kind of detached calm that combat veterans developed when witnessing events too devastating for normal emotional processing. Her father's training had included preparation for the destruction of equipment and supplies, teaching her that attachment to material objects was a weakness that enemies would exploit whenever possible. But beneath the tactical acceptance ran a deeper current of rage that required every technique she had learned about emotional control to contain. These weren't just papers being destroyed. They were hours of dedicated effort, evidence of her commitment to education as a path toward honoring her father's memory. And perhaps most importantly, they represented her attempt to build a normal teenage life, despite the extraordinary circumstances of her upbringing. When she reported the incident to Vice Principal Morrison, a well-meaning but overwhelmed administrator who seemed to view his job primarily as damage control rather than education, Bridget had produced 2 witnesses who swore they had seen Willa accidentally drop her bag into the sink herself. Autumn and Skylar had delivered their false testimony with the kind of practiced sincerity that came from extensive experience in manipulating adult authority figures. "We felt so bad for her," Skylar had told Vice Principal Morrison, with tears in her eyes that appeared genuine, even though Willa could see the calculated cruelty behind them. "She seemed really upset about getting a B- on that chemistry test, and she just threw her whole bag into the sink. We tried to help her save her papers, but it was too late." The false witnesses had transformed Willa from victim to perpetrator in the official record, creating a narrative where her own emotional instability was responsible for the destruction of her academic work. Vice Principal Morrison, faced with conflicting accounts and no physical evidence to support either version of events, had chosen to accept the testimony of students whose parents were active in school fundraising and whose behavior had never previously resulted in formal complaints. Willa had left the administrative office with a formal notation in her permanent record suggesting emotional problems and self-destructive behavior, consequences that could follow her to college applications and future academic opportunities. The incident had demonstrated the sophisticated nature of her tormentors' campaign, their understanding of how to manipulate institutional systems to not only avoid punishment, but actually turn those same systems against their victims. The gymnasium locker room provided another hunting ground where Bridget and her followers could operate with virtual impunity during the chaotic periods surrounding physical education classes. The space, with its maze of metal lockers and limited sightlines, offered numerous opportunities for harassment that could be explained away as accidents or misunderstandings if any adult happened to witness them. Bridget would wait until Willa was changing for PE, timing her approach for moments of maximum vulnerability when her victim was partially undressed and focused on the mechanics of switching between street clothes and athletic wear. The psychological impact of being targeted while in a state of undress added an additional layer of humiliation to encounters that were already designed to establish dominance through intimidation. Accidentally slamming locker doors on Willa's fingers became a favorite tactic, the metal edges catching her knuckles with impacts that left bruises and made it difficult to write or hold textbooks for days afterward. The injuries were minor enough to avoid serious medical attention, but persistent enough to serve as constant reminders of her helpless position in the school's social hierarchy. "Oh, I'm so sorry," Bridget would exclaim with theatrical concern after catching Willa's hand between the heavy metal door and its frame. "These old lockers are so hard to control sometimes. You really should be more careful about where you put your fingers." The false sympathy was accompanied by offers of assistance that were actually opportunities for additional harassment, allowing Bridget to help examine the injury while applying just enough additional pressure to maximize discomfort without creating obvious evidence of intentional harm. Other students in the locker room would witness these encounters, but had learned through experience that intervening would only result in them becoming targets themselves. Willa's clothes would frequently be knocked to the dirty floor during these encounters, forcing her to choose between wearing dirty garments or arriving late to class, while she attempted to clean mud and debris from fabric that was often her only clean outfit available. The locker room's concrete floor collected dirt, hair, and various forms of organic matter that were ground into any fabric that came into contact with its surface, creating stains that were difficult to remove even with careful washing. The basketball courts during lunch became a stage for public humiliation, with Bridget loudly commenting on Willa's appearance whenever she passed through the area on her way to other parts of the campus. These performances were carefully timed to coincide with periods when maximum numbers of students would be present to witness them, turning Willa's daily movements into opportunities for entertainment at her expense. "Look at those clothes," Bridget would announce to her assembled audience of followers and opportunistic observers, her voice carrying clearly across the gymnasium space. "Does she even own a mirror? I mean, seriously, would it kill her to make some effort with her appearance?" The commentary would continue as long as Willa remained within sight, a running catalogue of imagined flaws and deficiencies that served both to establish Bridget's position as arbiter of social acceptability and to reinforce Willa's status as someone whose very existence was inherently ridiculous. The audience for these performances would laugh on cue, their participation ranging from genuine amusement to nervous compliance with social expectations they were afraid to challenge. "Maybe someone should start a GoFundMe to get her some decent clothes," Autumn would add, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to ensure that Willa could hear every word, while maintaining plausible deniability about whether the comments were intended to be overheard. I mean, we can't let her walk around looking like a refugee forever. The systematic nature of these attacks went beyond simple bullying into the realm of psychological warfare, designed not just to cause immediate discomfort, but to erode Willa's sense of self-worth and social belonging over time. Each incident was calibrated to cause maximum emotional damage, while remaining just below the threshold that would trigger serious administrative intervention, demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how to operate within the grey areas of institutional policy. Through it all, Willa remained silent, enduring the daily torment with gritted teeth and white-knuckled control over emotional responses that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. Every fiber of her being wanted to fight back, to demonstrate exactly what she was capable of when pushed beyond reasonable limits. But she had made a promise to herself and to her father's memory that violence would not be her first response to conflict. Her father's lessons about choosing battles wisely echoed in her memory during the worst moments of harassment, reminding her that true warriors understood the difference between fights worth having and conflicts that would only create more problems. The tactical part of her mind continued to assess threats and calculate responses, but her commitment to honor her father's teachings about restraint and proportional response kept her from acting on those calculations. She reminded herself daily that these were just high school students acting out their own insecurities and social pressures, not enemy combatants engaged in actual warfare. The skills her father had taught her were designed for life and death situations where failure to respond appropriately could result in genuine casualties, not teenage social dynamics where the stakes were measured in embarrassment and social standing rather than blood and survival. But as the weeks stretched into months, the constant pressure began to erode even her considerable reserves of self-control. The hypervigilance that had been trained into her from childhood meant that she remained constantly aware of potential threats, scanning crowds for her tormentors and calculating escape routes from every room she entered. The stress of maintaining this level of awareness while trying to focus on academic work began to take a toll on her physical and mental health. Her sleep patterns became irregular as her mind refused to shut down the threat assessment protocols that had become automatic responses to her school environment. She would lie awake in her unfamiliar bedroom, surrounded by her aunt's well-meaning but inappropriate decorations, replaying the day's encounters and preparing mental responses for tomorrow's anticipated attacks. Her appetite diminished as the stress of constant harassment activated the same physiological responses her father had taught her to recognize in actual combat situations. Her body remained in a state of elevated alertness that made it difficult to relax enough for normal digestion, leading to weight loss that made her already small frame appear even more vulnerable to those who viewed her as an easy target. The breaking point came 3 months into the school year, triggered not by something done to Willa herself, but by the introduction of a new target who represented everything she had been taught to protect. David Chen transferred to Roosevelt High in October, arriving from a private school across town where his family had hoped he might find better academic opportunities and preparation for college applications to competitive engineering programs. David was everything that made him vulnerable to predators like Bridget Kane, obviously intelligent in a way that threatened those who coasted on privilege rather than merit, genuinely kind in an environment where cruelty was often mistaken for strength, and completely uninterested in the social games that defined high school hierarchies for those who lacked the confidence to exist without external validation. His gentle nature and obvious intelligence immediately caught Bridget's attention like blood in the water drawing sharks. David represented the kind of target she preferred, someone whose academic success highlighted her own intellectual limitations, whose quiet confidence exposed the insecurity behind her aggressive social dominance, and whose inherent decency made her own cruelty appear even more stark by comparison. David was also visibly different in ways that made him easy to target in a school where conformity was often enforced through systematic exclusion. His Korean heritage was evident in his features and occasionally in his accent when he spoke about topics that excited him enough to overcome his natural shyness. His clothes, while clean and well-maintained, lacked the designer labels and expensive cuts that served as social currency among Roosevelt High's elite students. Most importantly, David possessed the kind of authentic intellectual curiosity that Bridget found particularly threatening, because it reminded everyone around him that there were forms of value that couldn't be bought or inherited. His enthusiasm for science and mathematics, his careful attention to detail in everything from homework assignments to casual conversations, and his obvious dedication to learning for its own sake rather than for social status represented everything that Bridget's own educational experience lacked. Willa found herself drawn to David's quiet confidence and genuine smile from their first interaction, when he had been assigned to the empty seat next to her in advanced chemistry during his second day at Roosevelt High. While most students treated her as if she were invisible or actively avoided association that might damage their own social standing, David had simply introduced himself with the kind of natural politeness that came from good parenting rather than calculated social strategy. "I'm David," he had said, settling into his seat and organizing his materials with the kind of methodical precision that Willa recognized and appreciated. "I just transferred from St. Catherine's. I heard the chemistry program here is supposed to be really good." His smile had been genuine, free of the calculating assessment that characterized most social interactions at Roosevelt High. He hadn't seemed to notice or care about her thrift store clothing or her reputation as someone to be avoided, treating her instead with the same respectful attention he might have given to any potential lab partner. "Willa," she had replied, surprised by how normal her voice sounded, despite months of speaking only when absolutely necessary. "Welcome to Roosevelt. Mrs. Patterson is tough, but you'll learn a lot if you pay attention." That brief exchange had marked the beginning of the first genuine friendship Willa had experienced since arriving in Denver, a connection that grew slowly but steadily as they worked together on lab assignments and discovered shared interests in subjects ranging from renewable energy to military history. David's natural curiosity about the world extended to genuine interest in her background, though he was tactful enough not to push for details when she indicated that certain topics were difficult to discuss. For the first time since arriving at Roosevelt High, Willa felt like she might actually make a friend, someone who saw her as a person rather than a target or a liability. David's presence in her daily routine provided a buffer against the worst effects of her ongoing harassment, giving her something positive to focus on, even when Bridget and her followers were at their most creative in their cruelty. But Bridget noticed the connection immediately and saw an opportunity to inflict maximum damage on both of her targets simultaneously. She began targeting David with the same systematic cruelty she had shown Willa, but with additional elements of racial harassment that demonstrated the full extent of her willingness to exploit any vulnerability she could identify. The attacks on David began subtly, with comments about his appearance and mannerisms that were designed to make him self-conscious about characteristics he couldn't change. Bridget would make loud observations about his height, his voice, his choice of clothing, and his obvious intelligence, framing positive qualities as social liabilities that marked him as fundamentally different from students who belonged at Roosevelt High. "Look at him, always raising his hand like he knows everything," Bridget would announce during classes, where David's genuine enthusiasm for learning made him an active participant in discussions. "Some people just can't help showing off, I guess." The commentary escalated to direct attacks on his ethnic heritage, with Bridget making loud comments about his accent when he spoke up in class, even though David's English was flawless and his pronunciation clearer than many native speakers. She would make exaggerated attempts to pronounce his name incorrectly, claiming that it was too complicated for her to remember properly, and would encourage other students to exclude him from group activities by suggesting that his participation would somehow disadvantage their chances of success. "I don't know if we should put him in our study group," Autumn would say loudly enough for David to overhear during the organizational phase of group projects. "Those people are so competitive, and we're just trying to have fun while we learn." The harassment escalated when Bridget discovered that David had asked Willa to be his partner for the upcoming science fair, a collaboration that threatened her control over both of her targets while providing an opportunity for more sophisticated forms of psychological torture. The project assignment gave David and Willa legitimate reasons to spend time together, studying in the library and working on their presentation about renewable energy sources that combined David's theoretical knowledge with Willa's practical understanding of power generation systems used in military applications. Those afternoons in the library represented the first genuine happiness Willa had felt in months, providing refuge from the constant stress of navigating Roosevelt High's hostile social environment. David's enthusiasm for their shared project was infectious. His careful attention to research methodology and experimental design helping her understand that academic work could be genuinely rewarding rather than just another source of anxiety. Their collaboration revealed the depth of knowledge Willa had acquired through her unconventional upbringing, as she was able to provide insights into energy efficiency and power management that came from years of living in environments where resource conservation wasn't just academic theory, but practical necessity for survival. David's respect for her contributions, his genuine interest in her perspectives, and his complete lack of condescension made her feel intellectually valued for the first time since her father's death. Working together on the renewable energy project also allowed Willa to share carefully edited stories about her background, helping David understand something about the experiences that had shaped her worldview without revealing details that would have been inappropriate or potentially dangerous to discuss. She told him about military base housing and the emphasis on efficiency and sustainability that characterized life in those communities, about the importance of backup systems and redundancy in critical infrastructure, and about the way military families thought about resource management and environmental responsibility. David, in turn, shared his own family's immigrant experience, talking about his parents' emphasis on education as the path to success in their adopted country, their work ethic and dedication to providing opportunities for their children, and their hope that academic achievement might open doors that had been closed to previous generations. His stories helped Willa understand that there were many different ways to experience displacement and adaptation, many different forms of strength and resilience that didn't require the kind of combat training that had defined her own development. Their friendship deepened through these exchanges, built on mutual respect and shared intellectual curiosity, rather than the superficial attractions that seemed to define most teenage relationships. For both of them, the collaboration represented something rare and valuable, a connection with someone who understood what it meant to be an outsider, who valued genuine conversation over social positioning, and who was committed to excellence in pursuits that mattered rather than success in games that were ultimately meaningless. But Bridget destroyed that happiness with systematic precision that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so personally devastating. She spread rumors about Willa and David's relationship that ranged from crude sexual innuendo to accusations that their academic collaboration involved cheating or other forms of dishonesty. The rumors were carefully crafted to exploit existing prejudices and social tensions, designed to damage both of their reputations, while making it difficult for them to defend themselves without seeming to protest too much. "I heard they're doing more than just science experiments together," Schuyler would say, with theatrical surprise during conversations that were perfectly timed to occur when David or Willa might overhear. "I mean, she's so desperate for attention, and he probably thinks American girls are easy." The sexual rumors were particularly damaging because they carried implications that could affect both students' relationships with teachers and administrators, who might view any hint of inappropriate behavior as grounds for separating them or questioning their academic integrity. The racial component of the harassment added an additional layer of cruelty that demonstrated Bridget's willingness to exploit the worst aspects of prejudice and xenophobia to achieve her objectives. The orchestrated campaign of harassment extended to increasingly elaborate schemes designed to embarrass both David and Willa in public settings, where maximum numbers of witnesses would be present to amplify the social damage. Bridget would time her attacks to coincide with lunch periods, passing periods between classes, and other moments when the hallways or common areas were crowded with students who might spread word of whatever humiliation she had devised. She would trip David in the cafeteria, sending his lunch tray crashing to the floor, while the entire room erupted in laughter that felt orchestrated even when it was spontaneous. The timing of these incidents was always perfect, occurring when David was carrying maximum amounts of food and drink that would create the most dramatic splashes and spills when they hit the ground. "Oops, sorry," Bridget would exclaim with false concern while David knelt on the sticky cafeteria floor, trying to clean up rice and vegetables that had scattered across a wide area. "You should really be more careful. Those shoes must not have very good traction." The cleanup process became part of the humiliation, as David would be forced to crawl around on hands and knees while other students stepped around him, and cafeteria workers watched with expressions ranging from sympathy to irritation at the additional work his accident had created. The food stains on his clothes would remain visible for the rest of the day, serving as a reminder to everyone who saw him of his public embarrassment and social vulnerability. Similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency in other locations throughout the school, each one carefully planned to maximize psychological impact while maintaining plausible deniability about intentional harassment. Books would be knocked from David's arms as he walked between classes, sending papers flying across crowded hallways where they would be stepped on by passing students before he could retrieve them. Art projects would be accidentally damaged when Bridget or her followers bumped into David while he was carrying completed assignments, destroying weeks of careful work with impacts that appeared accidental but occurred with suspicious frequency. Science lab equipment would be accidentally knocked over when David was conducting experiments, ruining careful measurements and forcing him to start complex procedures from the beginning. The sabotage of their science fair project represented the culmination of Bridget's campaign against both David and Willa, an attack that went beyond personal harassment into the realm of academic sabotage that could have long-term consequences for their educational opportunities. The project itself had become a symbol of everything Bridget found threatening: academic excellence achieved through genuine effort rather than purchased privilege, collaboration based on mutual respect rather than social hierarchy, and success that came from intellectual merit rather than inherited advantage. David and Willa had spent weeks researching renewable energy technologies, conducting careful experiments to test the efficiency of different wind turbine designs, and constructing a working model that demonstrated the principles they had studied. Their research had been thorough and systematic, combining theoretical knowledge from multiple academic disciplines with practical engineering challenges that required creativity and persistence to solve. The wind turbine model itself was a masterpiece of careful construction, built from materials that David's father had helped them acquire and assembled with precision that reflected both students' attention to detail. The device actually worked, generating measurable amounts of electricity when exposed to controlled air currents, and their presentation included detailed analysis of power output, efficiency calculations, and potential applications for small-scale renewable energy generation. More importantly, the project represented something genuinely meaningful to both students. David's hope of pursuing engineering in college and eventually contributing to solutions for global environmental challenges, and Willa's desire to honor her father's memory by applying the practical skills he had taught her to constructive rather than destructive purposes. The science fair presentation was scheduled to be attended by representatives from several local universities, making it potentially important for college applications and scholarship opportunities. The discovery of their sabotaged project came on a cold November afternoon when David arrived at their shared locker, expecting to collect their materials for final preparations before the science fair competition. Instead, he found weeks of careful work destroyed with malicious thoroughness that went far beyond random vandalism into the realm of targeted destruction designed to cause maximum emotional as well as practical damage. Someone had broken into their locker using techniques that suggested familiarity with the school's security systems, destroying their research notes with systematic precision that indicated knowledge of which materials were most difficult to replace. Pages had been torn methodically rather than randomly, with particular attention paid to irreplaceable data from their original experiments and calculations that had taken days to complete. The wind turbine model, which had represented dozens of hours of careful construction and testing, had been dismantled with the same systematic precision, with critical components removed or damaged beyond repair. The destruction showed clear evidence of planning and intention rather than random vandalism, with expensive parts being specifically targeted for damage that would be most difficult and costly to repair. Most devastating of all, someone had poured sticky soda over everything in the locker, ensuring that even materials that hadn't been physically destroyed would be damaged beyond salvage. The combination of sugar and moisture had created a mess that adhered to every surface, making it impossible to save even fragments of their work that might have been incorporated into a hastily rebuilt presentation. Willa found David standing over the wreckage with tears in his eyes, his shoulders shaking with quiet rage that was all the more powerful for being completely controlled. His usual composure had cracked under the weight of seeing months of dedicated effort reduced to trash, and his struggle to maintain emotional control was painful to witness. 3 weeks of work, he whispered, holding up pieces of their destroyed wind turbine model with hands that trembled slightly. Everything we worked for, all those hours in the library, all those experiments, all those calculations, gone. His voice broke on the final word, and Willa felt something dark and cold settle in her chest as she surveyed the damage and understood the full scope of what had been done to them. This wasn't just vandalism or even typical bullying. This was an attack on their dreams, their academic futures, and their hope that hard work and genuine effort might overcome the advantages possessed by those who had been born into privilege and power. The tactical part of her mind immediately began assessing the situation with the kind of analytical detachment that her father had taught her to maintain even in moments of extreme emotional stress. The destruction was too systematic to be random, too thorough to be accidental, and too specifically targeted to their most vulnerable materials to be anything other than deliberate sabotage by someone who understood exactly what would cause maximum damage. The timing was particularly cruel, coming just days before the science fair competition when there would be no opportunity to rebuild or replace what had been destroyed. The sabotage had been calculated to ensure not just that their current project would fail, but that they would be eliminated from competition entirely, with no chance to demonstrate the knowledge and skills they had developed through weeks of dedicated effort. More importantly, this attack went beyond personal harassment into the realm of interference with their educational opportunities, potentially affecting college applications, scholarship eligibility, and their ability to pursue academic interests that might provide escape routes from the social dynamics that had made their high school experience miserable. Willa felt the careful control she had maintained over her emotional responses beginning to crack under the pressure of watching David's pain and recognizing the full implications of what had been done to them. Her promise to avoid violence felt less important than protecting someone who had shown her kindness, someone whose only crime had been treating her with respect and dignity in an environment where such basic human decency was apparently viewed as a threat worthy of destruction. That afternoon, as Willa walked toward her locker to collect her things before heading home to help her aunt with dinner preparation that had become one of their few successful bonding activities, she heard familiar laughter echoing from the second-floor hallway with the kind of malicious satisfaction that left no doubt about its source or meaning. Bridget's voice carried clearly through the empty corridor, filled with the kind of cruel pride that came from successfully executing a plan designed to cause maximum suffering to victims who had no effective means of retaliation. Her laughter had a sharp edge that spoke to deeper psychological currents than mere amusement, suggesting genuine pleasure derived from the pain of others. "Did you see his face when he found their little science project?" Bridget was saying to her assembled audience of followers and hangers-on who had learned to appreciate her cruelty as a form of entertainment. "I thought he was going to cry right there in the hallway. Actually, I think he might have been crying. It was pathetic." The description of David's emotional response was delivered with the kind of clinical detachment that sociopaths often displayed when discussing the suffering they had caused, as if his pain were nothing more than an interesting psychological phenomenon rather than the genuine anguish of someone whose dreams had been systematically destroyed. "The best part was how carefully they had arranged everything," Autumn added, her voice carrying the same tone of satisfaction that hunters might use when describing a particularly successful kill. Like they actually thought their pathetic little wind turbine was going to win anything against real competition. The casual dismissal of weeks of dedicated work as pathetic revealed the depth of contempt that Bridget's inner circle felt for anyone who achieved success through genuine effort rather than inherited privilege. Their inability to recognize or appreciate the intellectual achievement represented by David and Willa's project spoke to fundamental character flaws that went beyond simple meanness into the realm of genuine moral deficiency. Willa's hands clenched into fists as she approached her locker, trying to control the rage building in her chest like pressure in a steam boiler approaching dangerous levels. She turned her combination with deliberate precision, focusing on her breathing the way her father had taught her during training sessions, designed to maintain operational effectiveness under extreme stress. Violence was a last resort, she reminded herself, repeating her father's lessons like a mantra against the rising tide of anger that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained self-control. There had to be another way to handle this situation, some approach that would protect David without requiring her to break the promise she had made to herself and to her father's memory about choosing non-violent solutions whenever possible. She opened her locker door and began gathering her books with mechanical precision, trying to ignore the continued laughter from down the hall, while her mind ran through tactical assessments and response scenarios with the kind of automatic processing that had been trained into her through years of military-style preparation. Every option she could identify seemed to lead either to inadequate protection for future victims or to levels of violence that would violate everything her father had taught her about proportional response and moral responsibility. But then she heard David's name mentioned again, followed by a string of racial slurs that made her vision blur with anger and activated psychological responses that her father's training had specifically designed to override rational decision-making in situations where immediate action was required to protect innocent people from serious harm. "Hey, mouse girl!" Bridget's voice suddenly called out, using the nickname she had coined for Willa and now employed whenever she wanted to establish psychological dominance through verbal markers that reduced her victim to something less than fully human. "I hear you and your boyfriend are looking for a new science project." Willa closed her locker with deliberate calm and turned to face the three girls approaching her with the kind of predatory confidence that came from months of successful harassment campaigns conducted without meaningful consequences. Bridget wore her usual expression of cruel amusement, while Autumn and Skylar flanked her with eager anticipation that suggested they were looking forward to whatever entertainment their leader had planned. The hallway was empty, except for the four of them, most students having already left for the day in compliance with normal after-school schedules that made this confrontation feel orchestrated rather than accidental. Willa realized that this was no chance encounter. Bridget had planned this confrontation carefully, waiting until they would be alone and without witnesses who might interfere or provide testimony that could result in administrative consequences. "We didn't touch your stupid project," Bridget continued, her voice dripping with false innocence that made the lie even more insulting than direct admission would have been. "But I might have some ideas for your next one. Maybe something about genetics and why some people are just naturally better than others." The suggestion that genetic superiority explained social hierarchies revealed the depth of Bridget's racist worldview and her fundamental misunderstanding of both science and human nature. Her comment was designed to provoke a response that would justify whatever escalation she had planned, but it also demonstrated intellectual bankruptcy that made her previous academic sabotage even more reprehensible. "I don't want any trouble," Willa said quietly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins and the tactical calculations running automatically in the background of her consciousness. Her father's training had taught her to give potential adversaries every opportunity to de-escalate conflicts before resorting to physical solutions, both for moral reasons and because violence always carried risks that could be avoided through skillful diplomacy. "Of course you don't," Bridget laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement at what she perceived as weakness, but was actually the kind of restraint that required far more strength than anything she could understand. "You never want trouble. That's what makes you such perfect victim material. You're like a deer caught in headlights, too scared to run and too weak to fight." She stepped closer, using her height advantage to loom over Willa in a display of physical intimidation that would have been effective against someone who hadn't been trained to remain calm and analytical under pressure far more severe than anything a high school bully could generate. Her proximity was meant to trigger fear responses that would make rational thinking difficult, but Willa's training had specifically prepared her to function effectively when personal space was violated by potential threats. "But here's the thing, mouse girl," Bridget continued, her green eyes glittering with malicious anticipation. "I'm getting bored with the same old routine. Knocking your books around, spilling drinks on your pathetic clothes, making you look like the loser you are. It's all getting a little repetitive. I need something more dramatic." The admission that months of systematic harassment had been conducted purely for entertainment value confirmed everything Willa had suspected about Bridget's psychological makeup and demonstrated that appeals to conscience or empathy would be completely ineffective. This wasn't someone who could be reasoned with or reformed through gentle persuasion. This was a predator who viewed other people's suffering as a recreational activity. Before Willa could respond or attempt further de-escalation, Bridget nodded to her followers with the kind of practice signal that indicated this confrontation had been planned in advance. Autumn and Skylar moved with practiced coordination, grabbing Willa's arms and forcing her backward toward the bank of lockers that lined the hallway like metal coffins, waiting for their next victim. Willa's combat training immediately activated, her mind automatically cataloging angles and weak points while calculating the most efficient methods for disabling multiple opponents simultaneously. But she forced herself to remain passive, hoping against experience that this was just intimidation rather than an actual escalation to physical assault that would justify the kind of response her training had prepared her to deliver. "Open it!" Bridget commanded, and Skylar quickly spun the combination on an empty locker with the familiarity that suggested this wasn't the first time they had used this particular method of intimidation against vulnerable students. The metal door swung open with a creak that echoed through the empty hallway, revealing the narrow space designed to hold books and coats, but clearly intended by Bridget to serve as a prison cell for psychological torture that could have lasting effects on someone with claustrophobic tendencies or trauma related to confinement. The locker's interior dimensions were barely adequate for storage, let alone human occupancy, and the thought of being trapped in that metal box triggered survival instincts that her father's training had specifically designed to override rational analysis. Willa's eyes widened as she realized their intention, and for the first time since the harassment began, genuine fear crept into her voice despite all her training in emotional control under extreme stress. The prospect of being locked in a confined space where she would be completely helpless while her tormentors walked away brought back memories of training exercises where her father had taught her about prisoner of war scenarios and the importance of maintaining psychological resistance under conditions designed to break down mental defenses. "Don't," she said, struggling against their grip with carefully controlled movements that tested their strength and positioning without fully committing to violent resistance. "Please don't do this." Her plea was both genuine and tactical, giving her potential attackers one final opportunity to step back from a line that, once crossed, would justify responses that could have serious and permanent consequences for everyone involved. Her father had taught her that honorable warriors always gave their enemies chances to surrender or withdraw, not out of weakness but out of recognition that violence once begun was difficult to control and often led to outcomes that no one had intended. "What's wrong, mouse girl?" Bridget taunted, her voice carrying the kind of cruel pleasure that sadists derived from the suffering of helpless victims. "Afraid of small spaces? Don't worry, it'll only be for a few hours. Maybe overnight if the janitor doesn't hear you screaming." The threat to leave her imprisoned overnight transformed what might have been dismissed as a prank into something approaching false imprisonment and psychological torture, crimes that could have serious legal consequences if properly reported and prosecuted. But more immediately, it represented a level of escalation that crossed every boundary her father had established for when violent self-defense became not just justified, but morally necessary. They began forcing Willa toward the open locker, and she realized with crystal clarity that her promise to avoid violence had just become impossible to keep without sacrificing everything her father had taught her about protecting innocent people from predators who operated without conscience or restraint. These weren't just bullies anymore engaged in typical teenage social dynamics. They were predators who had escalated beyond anything she could passively endure without abandoning her responsibilities to herself and to future victims who would suffer if this behavior was allowed to continue unopposed. "Last chance," she said quietly, her voice taking on a tone that would have been immediately familiar to anyone who had served under Colonel Hartridge during combat operations, where lives hung in the balance and decisive action was the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. "Let me go now, and we can pretend this never happened." The offer was both a final attempt at de-escalation and a formal warning that she was prepared to use whatever force was necessary to protect herself from assault and unlawful imprisonment. Her father had taught her that honorable people always gave their adversaries clear notice before resorting to violence, both to maintain moral high ground and to ensure that any force used would be clearly justified as self-defense rather than aggressive action. Bridget laughed, the sound carrying genuine amusement at what she interpreted as an empty threat from someone she had spent months establishing as weak and helpless. Her complete inability to recognize the danger she was creating for herself and her followers spoke to the kind of chronic misjudgment that often afflicted bullies who had never encountered genuine resistance to their predatory behavior. "Or what?" she asked with theatrical incredulity. "You'll tell a teacher. We'll just say we found you stuck in there yourself. Poor little mouse girl, so clumsy and accident-prone. Everyone will believe us over you, just like they did when you accidentally destroyed your own homework in the bathroom sink." The reference to their previous successful manipulation of school authorities demonstrated Bridget's confidence that she could continue escalating her harassment without facing meaningful consequences. Her assumption that institutional protection would always be available to her, regardless of her behavior, revealed both the depth of her privilege and the fundamental corruption of systems that had allowed her predatory conduct to continue unchecked for so long. They shoved Willa forward toward the open locker, and she made her decision with the kind of clear-headed analysis that her father had trained her to maintain even under extreme stress. Her commitment to avoiding violence had been sincere and morally sound, but it had never been intended to protect predators from the consequences of their actions or to leave innocent people defenseless against assault and imprisonment. Her father's training took over with mechanical precision, muscle memory overriding conscious thought, as years of preparation activated automatically in response to the clear and present danger that her attackers had created. She went limp for a split second, causing Autumn and Skylar to loosen their grip as they struggled to support her suddenly dead weight, then exploded into motion with the kind of controlled violence that Special Forces personnel used when overwhelming force was required to end conflicts quickly and decisively. Her right elbow drove backward into Autumn's solar plexus with surgical precision, targeting the cluster of nerves beneath the sternum that would cause immediate incapacitation without creating permanent injury. The impact drove the air from Autumn's lungs and triggered involuntary muscle spasms that dropped her to her knees with a strangled gasp that echoed through the empty hallway like a wounded animal. Simultaneously, Willa's left hand grabbed Skylar's wrist and twisted with the kind of leverage-based technique that allowed smaller fighters to overcome larger opponents through superior knowledge of anatomy and physics. She used Skylar's own momentum against her, redirecting the girl's forward motion into a collision with the wall of lockers that produced a metallic clang loud enough to be heard throughout the second floor. The entire sequence took less than 3 seconds and demonstrated the difference between violence applied by someone who had been properly trained in its use versus the crude intimidation tactics employed by bullies who had never faced genuine resistance. Willa's movements were economical and precise, designed to neutralize threats quickly while minimizing the risk of causing permanent harm to opponents who were ultimately just misguided teenagers rather than enemy combatants. Bridget barely had time to register what was happening before Willa spun to face her, balanced on the balls of her feet in a combat stance that spoke of years of professional training and hundreds of hours of practice under conditions far more challenging than anything a high school hallway could provide. Her posture was relaxed but ready, her hands positioned for either defensive blocks or offensive strikes. her weight distributed to allow instant movement in any direction required by tactical considerations. "What the hell?" Bridget stammered, backing away from the small girl who had suddenly transformed into something dangerous and unfamiliar, someone whose presence radiated the kind of quiet lethality that experienced warriors developed through exposure to genuinely life-threatening situations. The transformation was so complete and so sudden that it took Bridget several seconds to process what she was witnessing. The meek, submissive victim she had been tormenting for months had vanished, replaced by someone whose every movement suggested training and experience in forms of conflict far more serious than high school social dynamics. "You want to know what I'm capable of?" Willa asked, her voice calm and controlled, despite the adrenaline surging through her system and the tactical assessments running automatically in her mind. "My father was Special Forces. He spent 12 years in combat zones before he came home and taught me everything he knew about surviving in hostile environments." The revelation of her background provided context for the skills she had just demonstrated, while serving as a warning about capabilities that her opponents couldn't possibly understand or effectively counter. Her father's military service wasn't just personal history. It represented access to training and knowledge that transformed her from potential victim into someone capable of defending herself against any threat these amateur bullies could pose. She advanced on Bridget with measured steps that maintained optimal distance for either defensive or offensive action, and the taller girl continued backing away until she hit the wall at the end of the hallway with a soft thud that emphasized her complete lack of escape options. The tactical situation had reversed completely, with Willa now controlling the physical space and psychological dynamics that had been used against her for months. "I've been trained to disarm opponents twice my size, to fight in close quarters where strength matters less than technique, and to neutralize threats using whatever tools are available," Willa continued, her voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that came from genuine competence rather than empty boasting. "I know 17 different ways to break bones with my bare hands, and I can drop someone your size unconscious in under 3 seconds. The specific details of her training were designed to help Bridget understand exactly how outmatched she was in any physical confrontation, but also to demonstrate that Willa's restraint up to this point had been a choice rather than an inability to defend herself. Every day of harassment she had endured could have been ended immediately if she had chosen to abandon her commitment to non-violent conflict resolution. Behind Willa, Autumn was still gasping for breath, while Skylar clutched her wrist and whimpered softly, both of them serving as evidence of what happened when someone with genuine combat training was forced to defend herself against amateur attackers who had mistaken their victim's restraint for weakness. "But more importantly," Willa said, stopping just inches from Bridget's face while being careful not to make physical contact that could be interpreted as assault rather than self-defense. "My father taught me that strength isn't about hurting people weaker than you. It's about protecting people who can't protect themselves." This was the core lesson that had guided everything her father had tried to teach her about the responsible use of force and the moral obligations that came with possessing skills that could cause serious harm to others. True warriors, he had always emphasized, fought to protect the innocent rather than to dominate the helpless, and they used their abilities to create peace rather than to impose their will through intimidation. She placed one hand flat against the wall next to Bridget's head, trapping the taller girl without touching her while demonstrating complete control over the tactical situation. The positioning allowed her to prevent escape while maintaining the kind of physical restraint that would be recognized as appropriate self-defense rather than aggressive assault if the encounter was later investigated by school authorities. "David Chen never did anything to you except exist in your world," Willa continued, her voice carrying the righteous anger of someone who had watched predators attack innocent people while honorable individuals stood by and did nothing to intervene. "He's kind, intelligent, and everything you pretend to be but aren't. And you've been tormenting him because you're too insecure to handle the fact that someone might see through your pathetic act. The analysis of Bridget's motivations was both accurate and devastating, cutting through the social facades and psychological defenses that had allowed her to rationalize months of cruel behavior as somehow justified or acceptable. The truth about her character, delivered by someone who had observed her conduct with the analytical detachment of a trained tactical observer, left no room for self-deception or face-saving explanations. I wasn't, Bridget started, but Willa cut her off with the kind of firm authority that brooked no argument or attempt at deflection. "Yes, you were," she said, with the certainty of someone who had spent months cataloguing evidence and analyzing patterns of behavior that revealed motivations and intentions more clearly than any verbal explanations could provide. "You've been systematically destroying his confidence, sabotaging his work, and trying to isolate him from anyone who might care about him. You've been doing the same thing to me for months, and I let it slide because I thought it wasn't worth fighting over." Her decision to tolerate the harassment directed at her personally had been based on her father's teachings about choosing battles wisely and avoiding conflicts that could be resolved through patience and strategic thinking. But the expansion of attacks to include David, particularly the sabotage of their academic work, had crossed lines that made continued restraint morally indefensible. Willa's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing Bridget to listen carefully while emphasizing the serious nature of what she was about to say. "But you crossed a line today. You destroyed something David worked hard on, something that mattered to him, and then you tried to lock me in a locker like some kind of prison." The escalation to physical assault and attempted imprisonment had transformed the situation from harassment that could be endured into criminal behavior that required immediate and decisive response. Her father's training had been explicit about the circumstances under which violence became not just justified, but morally necessary, and those circumstances had been clearly met by her attacker's actions. She leaned closer, and Bridget pressed herself back against the wall as if trying to disappear into the painted concrete. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated in the face of someone who clearly possessed both the capability and the moral authority to impose serious consequences for her behavior. "So here's what's going to happen," Willa continued, with the kind of calm certainty that came from having established complete tactical dominance over the situation. "You're going to apologize to David for destroying our project. You're going to leave both of us alone from now on, and if I ever see you bullying anyone else in this school, we're going to have another conversation that won't be nearly as pleasant as this one." The terms she was offering represented mercy rather than justice, giving Bridget an opportunity to reform her behavior and avoid consequences that would have been entirely justified given the severity of her crimes against multiple victims over an extended period of time. Her father had taught her that honorable warriors always offered their defeated enemies chances for redemption, both because revenge was morally corrupting and because genuine change was more valuable than punishment. "You can't threaten me," Bridget whispered, but her voice lacked any conviction and carried the kind of desperate hope that suggested she was looking for reassurance that the power dynamics she had relied on for so long might still provide some protection against the consequences of her actions. "I'm not threatening you," Willa replied, with the patience of someone who was committed to ensuring that her message was completely understood. "I'm educating you. There's a difference between using your strength to hurt people and using it to stop people from getting hurt. My father died protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and I'm not going to dishonor his memory by letting bullies like you make other people's lives miserable." The reference to her father's sacrifice provided context for her moral framework, while emphasizing that her commitment to protecting innocent people came from sources deeper than personal preference or temporary emotion. This was about honor, duty, and the responsibility that came with possessing capabilities that could make a difference in other people's lives. She stepped back, giving Bridget room to breathe while maintaining tactical awareness that would allow her to respond instantly if the situation escalated again. You have a choice now. You can learn from this and become a better person, or you can keep being a bully until you pick on someone who doesn't share my restraint. The warning was both a final offer of mercy and a realistic assessment of what would happen if Bridget continued her predatory behavior in an environment where not everyone possessed the moral framework that had led Willa to limit her response to exactly what was necessary to protect herself and future victims. Behind them, Autumn had managed to stand up, though she was still holding her stomach and breathing carefully to manage the pain from the precisely targeted strike that had temporarily disabled her without causing permanent injury. Skylar was examining her wrist with careful fingers, testing to see if anything was broken, while clearly understanding that she had been remarkably fortunate to escape serious harm. "Is she okay?" Willa asked, nodding towards Skylar without taking her eyes off Bridget, her question demonstrating the kind of concern for her opponent's welfare that distinguished honorable warriors from mere fighters. "Probably just bruised," Bridget answered automatically, then seemed surprised by her own response and the way she had instinctively provided information to someone she had been viewing as an enemy just moments before. "Good," Willa said with genuine relief that confirmed her commitment to using only the minimum force necessary to achieve her objectives. "I don't enjoy hurting people, but I won't hesitate to do it if that's what it takes to protect my friends." She picked up her backpack from where it had fallen during the brief struggle and slung it over her shoulder with movements that remained tactically aware but no longer projected immediate threat. "Oh, and Bridget, the next time you want to call someone Mouse Girl, you might want to remember that even mice will bite when they're cornered." The final warning carried layers of meaning that went beyond the immediate situation, serving both as a reminder of the lesson she hoped Bridget had learned and as guidance for how to interpret the behavior of other potential victims who might not be as restrained in their responses to systematic harassment. Willa walked away down the hallway with measured steps that projected confidence without aggression, leaving the three girls clustered together near the lockers to process what had just happened and consider the implications for their future behavior. She could hear them whispering urgently behind her, but she didn't look back or show any sign that she was monitoring their reactions. Her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline that was beginning to subside as the immediate threat passed and her nervous system started returning to normal operational status. Her father's training had prepared her for the physiological aftermath of combat situations, but experiencing it in a high school hallway felt surreal and disorienting compared to the military contexts where such reactions were expected and understood. She needed to find David to make sure he was okay and to explain what had just happened before he heard distorted versions from other students who would inevitably learn about the confrontation through the school's efficient gossip network. More importantly, she wanted to reassure him that the harassment would be ending and that they could focus on rebuilding their science project without fear of further sabotage. She found him in the library, sitting alone at a table in the back corner with his headphones on, staring at a blank notebook with the kind of defeated posture that spoke to emotional exhaustion beyond what any teenager should have to endure. The sight of his dejection reinforced her conviction that her actions had been not just justified, but morally necessary to protect someone who had never done anything to deserve the treatment he had received. "Hey," she said softly, pulling out the chair next to him while being careful not to make sudden movements that might startle someone who was clearly processing significant emotional trauma. David looked up when she approached, and she could see the disappointment and hurt still written across his face, despite his obvious efforts to maintain composure in a public space where emotional displays might attract unwanted attention or provide ammunition for further harassment. He pulled off his headphones with movements that seemed to require more effort than such a simple action should have demanded. "How are you holding up?" she asked, though the answer was obvious from his appearance and body language. He shrugged with the kind of studied casualness that teenagers use to minimize their pain when they believed that expressing genuine emotion would make them appear weak or vulnerable to those who might exploit such revelations. "I keep thinking about all the work we put into that project," he said quietly, his voice carrying the hollow tone that came from having something meaningful destroyed by people who couldn't understand its value. 3 weeks of research, building the model, practicing our presentation, all those hours in the library working through calculations, testing different designs. Gone. His voice broke slightly on the final word, and Willa felt a renewed surge of anger at the casual cruelty that had reduced weeks of dedicated effort to garbage scattered across the floor of a vandalized locker. The destruction hadn't just damaged their academic project. It had attacked their hope that hard work and genuine effort might overcome the advantages possessed by those who had been born into privilege and power. "We can rebuild it," she said with confidence that was based both on her assessment of their combined capabilities and on new information about their future working conditions that David didn't yet possess. "I have copies of most of our research at home, and I remember how we constructed the turbine. It won't take nearly as long the second time around." David managed a small smile that was the first genuine expression of hope she had seen from him since discovering the sabotaged project. "You really think we can pull it together in time for the fair?" "I know we can," she said with conviction that came from understanding that they would no longer be working under the threat of further harassment or sabotage. "But first, there's something I need to tell you about what just happened with Bridget." She gave him a careful account of the confrontation, including enough detail to help him understand that the harassment would be ending while leaving out some of the more violent specifics that might have been disturbing or difficult to process. Her description focused on the resolution rather than the conflict itself, emphasizing that they would now be able to work without fear of interference, rather than dwelling on the methods that had been necessary to achieve that outcome. David listened with growing amazement, occasionally asking questions about her background and training that revealed his genuine interest in understanding the experiences that had shaped her capabilities and worldview. His curiosity was respectful rather than intrusive, focused on comprehension rather than sensationalism. "Your father taught you all that?" he asked when she finished her explanation, his voice carrying admiration rather than fear or concern about the violence that had been necessary to end their torment. "He wanted me to be able to take care of myself, no matter what situation I found myself in," she replied, thinking about all the lessons that went far beyond physical techniques to include moral frameworks and ethical guidelines that had governed her response to the crisis they had just navigated. "I never thought I'd actually need to use it in high school." "I'm glad you did," David said quietly, his voice carrying relief that went beyond mere gratitude to encompass hope that they might actually be able to complete their education without constant fear of harassment and sabotage. "I was starting to think about transferring schools. This place was becoming unbearable." The admission that he had been considering abandoning his education rather than continuing to endure systematic abuse reinforced everything Willa believed about the moral necessity of protecting innocent people from predators who operated without conscience or restraint. His academic potential, His genuine enthusiasm for learning and his basic human dignity had all been under attack by people who viewed his suffering as entertainment. "You shouldn't have to leave because of them," she said with conviction that came from her father's teachings about standing up to bullies and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Nobody should have to abandon their dreams because small-minded people are threatened by anyone who achieves success through genuine effort rather than inherited privilege. Over the following days, word of the confrontation spread through Roosevelt High with the speed and distortion typical of high school gossip networks that transformed simple events into elaborate narratives that often bore little resemblance to actual facts. Some versions had Willa single-handedly defeating 10 opponents in an elaborate martial arts battle that involved multiple weapons and resulted in numerous hospitalizations. Other stories claimed she had used military equipment or that the whole thing was an elaborate hoax designed to enhance her reputation and intimidate her enemies. More creative versions suggested that she was actually an undercover government agent whose presence at Roosevelt High was part of a classified operation to investigate domestic terrorism threats among teenage social media networks. But the core truth remained consistent across all versions of the story, regardless of how much dramatic embellishment had been added by successive retellings. Quiet, invisible Willa Hartridge had stood up to Bridget Kane and her followers in a confrontation that had ended with the bullies backing down and promising to leave their victims alone. The change in school dynamics was immediate and dramatic, affecting not just Willa and David's daily experience, but the entire social ecosystem that had been shaped by years of systematic harassment and intimidation conducted by students who had operated with virtual impunity. Bridget and her followers kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact with Willa whenever their paths crossed in hallways or common areas that had previously been hunting grounds for their predatory behavior. Their withdrawal from active harassment created a power vacuum that was quickly filled by students who had previously been too intimidated to challenge the established social hierarchy. Teachers noticed that classroom discussions became more lively as students who had been afraid to speak up for fear of becoming targets began participating more actively in academic activities. Other students began approaching Willa with a mixture of curiosity and respect, some thanking her for standing up to bullies who had made their own lives miserable through systematic campaigns of psychological warfare that had gone unchallenged for years. These conversations revealed the extent to which Bridget's behavior had affected the entire school community, creating an atmosphere of fear and intimidation that had stifled academic achievement and personal growth for numerous students. "Thank you," whispered a sophomore girl whose name Willa didn't know, but whose face she recognized from the cafeteria where she had often seen her sitting alone, while other students avoided associating with anyone who might be viewed as socially unacceptable. "She used to make fun of my clothes every day. Since what happened with you, she hasn't said anything to me at all." Similar expressions of gratitude came from students across different grade levels and social groups, revealing that Bridget's predatory behavior had affected a much larger population than Willa had realized. The systematic nature of the harassment had created ripple effects throughout the school community, discouraging academic achievement and personal expression among students who had learned to keep their heads down and avoid attracting the attention of those who viewed other people's suffering as entertainment. David blossomed in the new environment like a plant that had been moved from shade into sunlight, his natural confidence returning as the constant harassment ended and he could focus on academic work rather than survival strategies. His enthusiasm for learning, which had been dampened by months of systematic abuse, returned with renewed vigor as he no longer had to worry about being punished for intellectual achievement. Together, they rebuilt their science project with help from several other students who volunteered their time and expertise once they understood that the work would no longer be subject to sabotage by those who were threatened by genuine academic accomplishment. The collaborative effort became a community project that brought together students from different social groups who discovered shared interests in renewable energy technology and environmental sustainability. Their presentation on renewable energy sources won second place at the science fair, but more importantly, it marked the beginning of genuine friendships for both Willa and David, with classmates who appreciated intellectual achievement and personal integrity, rather than inherited privilege or social manipulation. The recognition they received for their work opened doors to college scholarship opportunities and summer research programs that could have significant impacts on their future academic and professional development. The most surprising change came from Bridget herself, whose response to defeat revealed character depths that had been hidden beneath layers of privilege and entitlement that had never been challenged by meaningful consequences for her actions. 2 weeks after their confrontation, she approached Willa after chemistry class with obvious nervousness, her usual entourage notably absent as she prepared to have a conversation that required genuine vulnerability rather than the performative dominance that had characterized her previous interactions. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked, her voice lacking the typical edge that had made every previous conversation feel like psychological warfare designed to establish dominance rather than achieve communication. Willa nodded and waited while the classroom emptied, giving Bridget the privacy she seemed to need for whatever she was preparing to say. The moment felt significant in ways that went beyond typical teenage social dynamics, representing a potential turning point that could affect not just their personal relationship, but the entire school environment that had been shaped by years of systematic harassment and intimidation. "I wanted to apologize," Bridget said, the words coming out in a rush that suggested she had been rehearsing this speech but was still nervous about actually delivering it. "Not just for the locker thing, but for everything. The way I treated you and David, the way I destroyed your project, the way I made your lives miserable for months. It was wrong, and I know that now." The apology was more comprehensive than Willa had expected and seemed to come from genuine recognition of the harm that had been done, rather than from fear of additional consequences or hope of avoiding future punishment. This suggested character development that went beyond mere tactical adaptation to changed circumstances. "What changed your mind?" Willa asked, genuinely curious about the psychological processes that had led someone who had seemed to enjoy inflicting suffering on others to apparently develop empathy and moral understanding that had been completely absent from her previous behavior. Bridget was quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands while clearly struggling with emotional responses that were unfamiliar and difficult to articulate. When she finally looked up, her expression carried vulnerability that Willa had never seen before, suggesting that the confident cruelty she had displayed for months had been masking deeper insecurities and pain. "You could have really hurt me that day," she said quietly, her voice carrying recognition of just how completely the power dynamics had shifted during their confrontation. "I could see it in your eyes. You knew exactly how to make me pay for what I'd done. You could have broken bones, put me in the hospital, made sure I never felt safe again, but you chose not to." The admission revealed that Bridget had understood, perhaps for the first time in her life, what it felt like to be completely helpless in the face of someone who possessed overwhelming advantages and the willingness to use them. The experience had apparently provided her with insight into the psychological impact of her own behavior on others. She looked up, meeting Willa's gaze directly for the first time in weeks, her green eyes showing emotions that seemed genuine rather than calculated. My older brother bullied me for years before he left for college. I know what it feels like to be powerless, to have someone bigger and stronger making your life miserable just because they can. I swore I'd never be like him, but somehow I ended up being exactly the same. The revelation of her own victimization provided context for her behavior without excusing it, suggesting that cycles of abuse often perpetuated themselves unless consciously interrupted by people who chose to break patterns rather than continue them. Her recognition that she had become the same kind of person who had tormented her showed developing self-awareness that could be the foundation for genuine change. "You can choose to be different," Willa said, with the kind of firm compassion that her father had taught her to show toward enemies who were willing to acknowledge their mistakes and work toward redemption. "It's not too late to change, but it has to be a real commitment, not just words designed to avoid consequences." "I don't know if people will let me change," Bridget said with obvious concern about the social consequences of her previous behavior and the difficulty of rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by months of systematic cruelty. "I've been such a bitch to so many people that they might never forgive me, even if I genuinely try to be better." "People are more forgiving than you think, especially if you're genuinely trying to make amends," Willa replied, drawing on her father's teachings about redemption and second chances. "But you have to mean it, and you have to be consistent. One apology doesn't erase months of harassment. You'll have to prove through actions over time that you've actually changed." The conversation continued for several more minutes, covering practical strategies for making amends to previous victims and developing new patterns of behavior that would demonstrate genuine character development rather than temporary tactical adjustments to change circumstances. By the time they finished talking, both girls understood that this was the beginning of a potentially long process rather than a simple resolution to past conflicts. Over the remaining months of the school year, Bridget proved true to her word through actions that gradually rebuilt trust and respect among classmates who had learned to fear and avoid her. She began speaking up when she witnessed bullying, using her social influence to shut down cruel gossip and exclusionary behavior rather than to promote it. She apologized individually to every student she had tormented, accepting their anger and skepticism with patience she had never shown before, while working to demonstrate through consistent behavior that her commitment to change was genuine rather than performative. Some students were more willing to forgive than others, but even those who remained wary had to acknowledge that her behavior had improved dramatically. The transformation wasn't immediate or perfect, and there were occasions when Bridget slipped into her previous patterns of behavior before catching herself and working to correct course. But each time this happened, she recovered more quickly and showed greater awareness of the impact her words and actions had on others. Old habits died hard, particularly for someone who had spent years developing sophisticated systems of psychological manipulation and social control. But Bridget's commitment to change appeared genuine and was supported by growing understanding of the harm she had caused and the better person she could choose to become. Willa watched this evolution with cautious optimism, remembering her father's lessons about second chances and the importance of redemption in any healthy society. She didn't forget the months of harassment or the damage that had been done to David's confidence and academic work. But she chose to focus on the possibility that people could genuinely change when given the right motivation and support. Her father had taught her that true warriors fought not to destroy their enemies, but to create conditions where former enemies could become allies in building something better than what had existed before. Bridget's transformation suggested that even the most damaged people could choose to become better versions of themselves when faced with consequences that helped them understand the real impact of their behavior on others. As spring semester drew to a close, Willa found herself reflecting on everything that had happened since her confrontation with Bridget and the ways in which that single moment had changed not just her own life, but the entire social dynamics of Roosevelt High School. She had learned that her father's training extended far beyond physical techniques to include moral frameworks that guided decision-making in complex situations where simple solutions were rarely available. The lessons about choosing the right battles had proved applicable not just to military conflicts, but to civilian situations where protecting innocent people required standing up to those who abused positions of power or privilege. Her father's emphasis on showing restraint in victory had been crucial to achieving outcomes that improved conditions for everyone, rather than simply replacing one form of oppression with another. Most importantly, she had discovered that true strength came from protecting others rather than dominating them, from building up rather than tearing down, and from creating conditions where everyone could flourish rather than ensuring that only the powerful prospered at the expense of those who couldn't defend themselves. The shy, invisible girl who had arrived at Roosevelt High no longer existed. But the transformation hadn't been about becoming more aggressive or intimidating. Instead, she had learned to project the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who she was and what she stood for, the kind of presence that commanded respect through character rather than fear. David had become not just a friend, but someone she cared about deeply. Their shared experience of overcoming adversity, creating a bond that went beyond typical high school relationships to encompass mutual respect and genuine understanding of each other's character and values. Their friendship had provided both of them with emotional support during difficult times and intellectual stimulation that enhanced their academic achievement and personal growth. Together, they had started a peer mediation program that helped other students resolve conflicts before they escalated into harassment or violence, drawing on lessons learned from their own experiences to create systems that protected vulnerable students while providing opportunities for those who had made mistakes to learn better ways of interacting with their peers. On the last day of school, as Willa cleaned out her locker for the final time, and prepared to say goodbye to an institution that had taught her as much about human nature and moral courage as about academic subjects, she found a note that had been slipped through the vents sometime during the previous week. The message was from a sophomore girl she barely knew, but whose story had become familiar through the peer mediation program they had established. It was a simple expression of gratitude that carried profound meaning about the ripple effects of choosing to stand up for what was right, rather than accepting injustice as an inevitable part of life. "You probably don't remember me," the note read in careful handwriting that suggested the author had taken time to compose her thoughts before committing them to paper. "But Bridget and her friends used to make fun of my clothes every day. They would laugh at my shoes, comment on my hair, and make sure everyone knew that I wasn't good enough to be part of their social circle." The description of systematic harassment was familiar from dozens of similar stories that had emerged once students felt safe enough to discuss their experiences with bullying and intimidation that had shaped their entire high school experience. "After what happened with you, they stopped completely," the note continued. "But more importantly, other kids started standing up for me when anyone tried to continue that kind of behavior. You changed everything for a lot of us, not just by stopping the bullying, but by showing us that we didn't have to accept being treated badly just because we weren't part of the popular crowd." The final paragraph captured something important about leadership and moral courage that went beyond individual acts of self-defense to encompass broader changes in social expectations and community standards. "I wanted you to know that what you did mattered to more people than you probably realize. You didn't just protect yourself and David, you made our whole school a place where people can focus on learning and growing instead of just trying to survive until graduation. Thank you." Willa smiled as she folded the note carefully and placed it in her backpack next to similar messages from other students who had found the courage to speak up once they understood that systematic harassment didn't have to be accepted as a normal part of teenage life. Her father had always told her that the measure of a person wasn't in their ability to fight, but in their willingness to stand up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The note, and others like it, suggested that she had honored his memory in the best way possible, not through violence or revenge, but through the courage to do what was right when it mattered most. As she walked out of Roosevelt High for the last time, Willa carried with her the knowledge that she had transformed not just her own life, but the lives of everyone around her through choices that had required moral courage as much as physical capability. The quiet storm that had been building inside her had finally found its purpose, creating positive change that would continue long after she had graduated and moved on to the next phase of her life. Some battles, she had learned, were worth fighting not because they were easy or safe, but because the alternative was allowing good people to suffer while bad people prospered through the use of power without conscience or restraint. But the greatest victories came not from defeating enemies, but from helping them become better than they had been before. The lessons her father had taught her about strength, honor, and responsibility had proved applicable far beyond the military contexts for which they had originally been designed. In the end, the same principles that guided elite soldiers in combat operations could help anyone navigate the complex moral challenges of civilian life, creating communities where everyone could thrive rather than mere survival being the best outcome most people could hope to achieve. Her transformation from victim to protector, from invisible to respected, from powerless to influential, represented something that went beyond personal growth to encompass the kind of leadership that could change institutions and communities for the better. The girl who had arrived at Roosevelt High, hoping only to graduate quietly, had discovered that sometimes quiet people had the loudest impact when they finally chose to speak.